Good afternoon. My name is Michael Smith. I'm Senior Vice President of Social Innovation here at the Case Foundation. We are incredibly excited to have all of you joining us here today, both in person and online. We have an enthusiastic and I would say esteemed audience here in the room and online with us. And to get started, we have just a few housekeeping items for both of you. First, for our in-person guests, please turn your cell phones not off, but to silent, because we encourage you to tweet, and we will not be offended. Steve will have no problem with this. We will not we will not be offended if you're looking down at your smartphones and your iPods and your iPads while we are having this meeting. And when you tweet, please use the hashtag #BeFearless. In-person guests, this event is being live streamed, as I just mentioned, so please do not stand or walk in the area in front of the camera, which is denoted by this area rug here. Please use the doors to the side. During each section of the agenda, we will take questions from the in-person and online audience. In-person audience, when the moderator asks for questions, simply raise your hand, and one of our team members will come around with a roving microphone. When you are called on, please stand up so we can see you on camera. To the live stream, online viewers, please submit questions either using the chat box on Ustream or via Twitter. If you're submitting questions via Twitter, please use the hashtag #BeFearless and direct your tweets towards @Case Foundation so we can make sure we see you. And as a bonus for all the dutiful watchers online, 10 lucky watchers will have a chance or will win Walter Isaacson's new autobiography of Steve Jobs. So be active and ask questions. So now it's time to get started. 15 years ago, Gene and Steve Case found that AOL, their 20-year overnight success story, as Steve likes to call it, was yielding some pretty significant dividends. Not only would it forever change the way that people connect, communicate, and collaborate, the success would also provide Gene and Steve with a larger set of tools and resources to take their family's commitment to giving back to new heights. So in 1997, they created the Case Foundation, and for the past decade and a half, which is hard to believe because I've been there for a portion of that, they have sought to leverage their investment capital, broad network of passionate people which are gathered in the room and online, and their own experiences as entrepreneurs and civic leaders to accomplish a simple mission: investing in people and ideas that can change the world. Please welcome the co-founders of the Case Foundation, Gene and Steve Case.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for everybody who's joined us here in person, everybody who's joining us online. Obviously like the online guys.
We do.
It's a great day. We're really celebrating three things here. The first, as Michael mentioned, is the 15th anniversary of starting the Case Foundation. The second is thanking everybody, including the team at the Case Foundation and many of the partners in the room or watching it via the live stream, for their help over the last 15 years. And third is kind of kicking off the next chapter, the next 15 years, by launching this Be Fearless campaign. When we got started 15 years ago, we were in our 30s still. Now we're in our 50s. And so we knew we had a lot to learn, but we thought some of the lessons we had learned in building the AOL and trying to make the internet part of everyday life could apply. And a lot of those were around investing in people and ideas. A lot of those were around building alliances and driving a lot of collaboration. And a lot of that was partnering with some of the great iconic organizations already in place, the Boys and Girls Club or City Year or many of the other organizations that we got involved in, Special Olympics, in those early years. We've obviously learned a lot over the past 15 years, both things that worked that we learned from, as well as things that didn't work that we learned even more from. And that's part of what you'll hear about this whole idea of Be Fearless. But it never would have happened without the great team that we've been able to assemble that really believes in the mission of the Case Foundation, believes they are able to make the world a little bit better place because of our efforts, and particularly the work of the partners, because this collaboration aspect we knew was important. We now even know it's even more important, trying to knit together people to create a kind of shared interest, find common ground, because we recognize that we can do a little, but together we can do a lot. And we particularly love the African proverb. It's even in the Be Fearless material that we're distributing today, that if you want to you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, you got to go together. And that's certainly been a lesson we've learned. I think we've all learned in our work. But we didn't want to stop there. We didn't want to just have a party to celebrate our 15th anniversary, although I guess we'll do a little of that later. And we didn't just want to say thank you to the partners, although we're grateful. We also wanted you view it as sort of a launch pad for the next chapter, building on the lessons we've learned over the past 15 years and try to usher in the next 15 years. And that's really the core of what this Be Fearless campaign is all about. And to tell you more about that and to kind of take us through the next section of this, I'm delighted to introduce my wife, who is, as you all know, not only the CEO of the Case Foundation, really the brains behind the Case Foundation. And I've been delighted to be working with her, but mostly watch her in admiration over the last 15 years as she's taken these ideas and really taken them to scale. And with that.
Great, thanks. That was sweet, Steve, thanks. So, there's a lot of ways, as Steve said, that you could spend a 15th anniversary, and we actually talked about a lot of different things. But I think I was unprepared ahead of today for sitting in this chair and looking out at some of the faces and realizing I'm actually watching a 15-year journey unfold, because we have worked shoulder to shoulder with many of you. We have watched your work and listened to you and learned from you, and we hope to continue to do so. So it seems super fitting that you're with us, and we're enormously grateful. We said really all the people sitting in chairs here and many joining us online as well could actually be up here instead of us, and so we appreciate that you're with us, and today is about celebrating you too. So on the occasion of our 15th anniversary, what we really decided to do was to hit the pause button, and specifically hit the pause button and ask ourselves and our partners some really key questions. So we looked around and we looked back, both at our work and the work of others, and we said, what's worked and what hasn't? As we looked at communities and the world around us today, we see really an unprecedented pace of change that demands sort of new ways of doing and new ways of thinking. We see a global economic crisis. We see unprecedented, daunting social problems. We see civic unrest. But we also see some really, really bright spots, some breakthroughs that happen. So we stepped back and said, all right, what's going on here? There's some things where there just hasn't been enough progress. We know as a sector, those of us charged with finding and funding solutions to social problems we care about, sometimes we find ourselves moving too slow, or accepting incremental change, or letting fear guide us from time to time. So when we stopped and looked around and looked back at the really terrific bright lights, what we saw was breakthroughs happened when people acted with boldness, when they were led by urgency and a sense that something needs to get done here and we have to get to the task of doing it. In short, when people were fearless. Which led us to today, which led us to what we're going to talk to you about today, and what we're hoping is a dialogue we'll have with you that really kicks off today. And we hope it kicks off in all kinds of organizations, among all kinds of people, in all kinds of different ways. Today is really about releasing a set of principles that we have put together using some experts in philanthropy. Brad Rourke, where are you? I know you're here. Brad Rourke and Cindy Gibson, whom many of you know as great thought leaders in philanthropy, we took the concept of Be Fearless to them and said, will you scour the landscape? Will you talk to organizations? Will you look at great stories and tell us great stories of where the breakthroughs were and what were the key characteristics? So that's what today is really about. It's about announcing some of those characteristics that we've discovered. We've put a paper out. We have a site out. We hope there's a lot of social media discussion. We hope to hear from you as part of this dialogue today and ongoing, and to say, what does it really take for the social sector specifically, government, philanthropy, nonprofits, to move at an unprecedented rate, to really move mountains, if you will, and do so with urgency. So that's why we're here today. So what we're going to do is play a little Be Fearless video to introduce the principles to you, of which there's 5. And then after that, we're going to move to a panel discussion. So at this time, I'd like to turn to the video. Okay, so as I said, we're going to kick it off with a panel, and as I also said, I actually could turn to any one of you, and I think you would be a qualified panelist, so it was hard to decide who to have up here and who wouldn't be up here today. But again, the idea of this is a dialogue, so hopefully we'll hear the voices from around the room and online as well. So I'm joined by two very important people, two of our favorite friends at the Case Foundation, and two models that we watch very closely in philanthropy and in the social sector. I must tell you there is a third chair there for a reason, because we're going to have a third panelist, but he warned us that he might be running a little bit late, and that's Senator Mark Warner. So why don't I get started with intros of Tom and Barbara, and then I'll talk a little bit about Mark before he comes, so that when he comes and takes his seat, we can just jump right into it with him. So starting with Tom Tierney to my left, I'm certain that everyone in this room certainly knows Tom, and I don't know if everybody online knows Tom as well. But Tom is what we think is perhaps among the most important voices in philanthropy today, if not the most important voice in philanthropy today. And it's true, Tom. You know I feel this way. Tom is someone we wanted to feature as a fearless leader today for a variety of reasons. Tom started his career in the private sector and had unbelievable success. He was CEO of Bain Capital until 1999, and at Bain Capital, he increased revenue sixfold.
Bain and Company. There's another guy from Bain
sorry,
Capital.
Bain and Company. I'm sorry.
In the news.
Thank you. Bain and Company. Bain and Company. While Tom was there, he grew revenue sixfold and expanded to a global reach. But the cool thing about Tom was at the height of his career, tremendous private sector success, he said, you know what, I think there might be a larger canvas to paint on here that might be more meaningful. And he took his time and his talents from Bain, and he started an organization called Bridgespan. And many of us know Bridgespan, and many of us have worked with Bridgespan, either in philanthropies or in nonprofits, because Bridgespan is an organization you call in when you want to have more impact, when you need help, when you need management consulting. So Tom's really considered one of the brightest guys. I mean, Tom, you lecture, you write at Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School. He also chairs the Social Enterprise Initiative at Harvard, which I have the privilege of serving with him on. I could go on and on about Tom Tierney, but there's an important reason he's here today, and we want to hear his voice. Most recently, and probably the most important element of what we're going to talk about today, Tom authored a book called Give Smart. And the whole idea is to how to have more impact in philanthropy. And he interviewed a number of leading philanthropists across the nation and across the world in that book. So we'll hear from him on that. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Welcome, Barbara. Barbara Bush is Chair and CEO of Global Health Corps. And I say she is an iconic model of her generation. We wanted Barbara on this panel because Barbara represents the best of the millennial generation. And when she first had her vision for Global Health Corps, we thought it was a fearless vision, and we thought it was fearless of her, the way that she took it forward. But in addition to Global Health Corps, Barbara has served as UNICEF's Next Generation Steering Committee member. She is a fellow at Echoing Green. She graduated from Yale in Humanities in 2004. And I think she would probably tell you she didn't expect to be sitting here today or doing what she's doing. Is that right, Barbara?
Yes, agreed.
Okay. And then the empty chair is Senator Mark Warner, who should be with us shortly. For those of you who know Senator Warner, you know he's a senator from Virginia. Before that, he was governor of Virginia. But Senator Warner is another example of a great private sector leader who transitioned over. He was one of the founders of the company that became Nextel. He founded here in Washington, D.C., Venture Philanthropy Partners, which really most of our giving in D.C. is done through Venture Philanthropy Partners. And Mark has just been an iconic leader of bipartisan coming together in a remarkable way. He led the Gang of Six in the Senate and was known both as governor and as a senator for the way that he brings both sides together. So we hope to hear from him today on some of those issues. So why don't we start with you, Tom, if we can?
Whatever you say, Jim.
All right. So, you know, you're here because you are a fearless leader, and we talked about your change up from the private sector to focusing on the nonprofit sector and working with philanthropists as well. You know, you've seen some of our fearless principles. You know what they are. Talk a little bit about what you see the great challenge being if we have, you know, philanthropy and nonprofits in the room. What do you see as the key element in terms of getting philanthropy to fearless?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm pleased to be here and hope I can be a little bit useful. It's hard to move philanthropy to fearless, and the reason is, in philanthropy, I'm fond of saying excellence is self-imposed. There are no external forces that will make you set the bar higher. You have to set it high for yourself. And by the way, some of that applies to life in general, but especially in philanthropy, where there's no such thing as, quote, failure. If you define philanthropy as simply giving money away, that's actually not so complicated. But if you define philanthropy as problem solving, as actually having consequences, then it's really hard. And so this notion that in philanthropy and in many other areas, but especially philanthropy, excellence is self-imposed has lots of implications. One of which is you better be real clear-minded about what it is you're trying to achieve. What's success? And how are you going to achieve that success? If you said, what is the root cause of much fearlessness in philanthropy? It's complacency. I call it the trap of wishful thinking. Because you can wishful think your way to all kinds of things. You can say, oh gosh, we're solving this problem, everything's better. You can confuse activity with consequences very easily. And especially in philanthropy, where people have a tendency to say nice things to you when you give away money. They don't tell you what's failing. Bridgespan's a nonprofit organization. If somebody gave us a grant for knowledge or something, we're unlikely, well, probably, to say, you know, boy, you really wasted that money, never do that again. Of course, we want to try to deliver on things. And so this notion that the excellence is self-imposed in philanthropy, or conversely, the natural state of philanthropy is underperformance, is a huge barrier. It's a huge barrier to actually getting results as opposed to just giving money away.
So this issue of defining success, you know, we talked earlier today, Tom and I did, about the importance when you start out in a partnership or in a collaboration, whether it's just the donor and the nonprofit, or whether it's a collaborative of a lot of groups working together, about pausing and defining success early on and having that conversation before you get started about, it sounds crazy, what are we trying to do here? And what does success look like? And what will your role be versus my role? Have you seen, when you compare sort of what you would call highly impactful philanthropy versus not, is that something that you see as a dividing line when success was more clearly spelled out in the beginning?
Absolutely. In the research that we did around Give Smart, I should say my co-author Joel Fleischman is multiples wiser than I am. It turns out if you write a book with a smarter, wiser person. It's just a useful approach. He was at Duke, but ran Atlantic Philanthropies, U.S. programs for years. And one of the things we did in Give Smart was essentially pattern recognition, identifying, you know, outstanding initiatives philanthropically over the last 100 years, what was working, what wasn't working. And one of the most clear patterns on this excellence is self-imposed is when things succeed, it's because the people, the philanthropists that are involved, are obsessed about results. They're obsessed about achieving success and how they are going to achieve it. We talked about pivot points. If they are not on track to success, they say, wait a second, this isn't working, let's pivot. Let's figure out what the right approach is that's going to make it work. If you're ambiguous in your own mind and others' minds about what an A looks like, or you haven't clearly thought about how that A is going to be achieved, then guarantee you're going to fall short. You're going to define philanthropy as a set of activities that make everybody apparently happy, as opposed to a strategy that actually solves problems. And this is the root cause of why, you know, I think unfortunately a lot of philanthropy is wasted. It's like the old adage about marketing. You know, we know half the money spent in marketing is wasted. We just don't know which half. I think that's not true of marketing any longer, right? There's a lot more sophisticated.
Right,
but it is true about
data.
Philanthropy.
Yeah, that's right.
There is actually a bottom half. I was at a board meeting once. You can't make this stuff up, and I'll be quiet. Is the end of the day, it was a really incredible board of foundation executives, leaders. You know, end of the day, really huge resumes. Everybody said, tell me about your bottom quartile of your giving. And one of the most accomplished gentlemen in the room spoke up and said, I think without quite thinking it through, we don't have a bottom quartile. Probably you do have a bottom quartile. You know, this is Lake Wobegon, right? All philanthropists are above average. Anyhow, this notion, if you don't have a clear mind about what success is and how you're going to achieve it, you're going to fall short, period.
Thanks, Tom. And we have a lot of nonprofit leaders in the audience with us as well, and we'd love to hear some of your thoughts on these concepts we're hitting on as well that we're talking about in philanthropy but apply to the nonprofits. Welcome, Senator Warner. Thank you for joining us.
Politician time.
We'll give you a moment to get comfortable. We did introduce you, and it was a great introduction before you were just like to say.
Do it again.
So we're going to ask Barbara a question, and then we'll jump right in with you, if that's okay. So Barbara, so for those of you that don't know, Barbara was asked to come to a very prestigious conference that happens every year called Fortune's Most Powerful Women. And I thought that was really terrific for you, Barbara, and I thought you did a great job there. But I learned some new things from you that day. And you know, we of course know the story of Global Health Corps, and for those of you that don't know it, I like to describe it as a little bit of Teach for America for health innovation, if you will. And I know I want you to talk about your model, but one of the things Global Health Corps does is it taps bright young people from all walks and from many different disciplines and puts them into the healthcare arena globally. And I think you have 90 fellows this year, and you're expecting to pick from 5,000 applications for those 90. So she's scaled the program. I think you hope to scale it to something like 500 fellows before you're done. But talk a little bit just about your background and what brought you to this, because I think for many it's a really great story, and it's a fearless story.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. And I also quickly wanted to point out one of Global Health Corps' other co-founders, Johnny Dorsey, is here too, so he could equally be up here. But in 2008, Johnny and I met, and we met a few of our other co-founders through a UNAIDS conference. And I, as Jean said initially, I had no intention of ever starting a nonprofit or really actually working in the global health field. I thought I wanted to be an architect, and that's what I studied, and that's what I was very much into when I was young. And then when I was in college, one of my...
When you were young?
Yes. I turned 30 this year, so... when I was in college in New Haven, one of my professors passed away because he was HIV positive, and I was pretty floored that I was living in New Haven, Connecticut, at one of the most expensive universities in the country, and one of my professors wouldn't have access to medicine. So I got pretty sort of obsessed with this problem that I saw. And at the same year, the same time that year, I got to travel to East Africa. And the same thing that my professor lacked, a lot of other people lacked, and that was just access to healthcare. And so I pretty much completely changed my course. I was 21. I quit my architecture major. I majored in humanities because that was possible at that time. I could apply everything to humanities, and it worked. And I could graduate on time. And then I ended up meeting this woman at a conference who was South African, and she worked at a children's hospital there. And I was like, oh, I'm obsessed with what you do. I just want to work on these issues so bad. I, feel so urgently like this can't happen in my lifetime, that people would die just because they don't have access to medicine. And so luckily she hired me, and I moved to South Africa, and my career just totally changed. And then I was lucky in that I got to work for UNICEF afterwards, and everything sort of luckily went in the right direction. And I never once regretted working on global health issues, and I actually am so happy I'm not an architect, because I would be very happy. But after many years, or after a few years of working in health, I started meeting my co-founders, Johnny, who is one, and we all met through a UNAIDS conference. And at the time, Peter Piot was the head of UNAIDS, and he was about to retire. And he had spent his whole career working on these huge issues, and he felt an enormous sense of urgency to make sure that people would continue making the changes in his life doing. And so Johnny and I met, and our 4 other co-founders and we ended up going to Baltimore and locking ourselves in my sister's house for the weekend, and really trying to think, how can we make sure our generation is going to continue the enormous progress that's already happened in global health, and actually not only continue it, but move the needle much more quickly, because we aren't doing enough. So we wrote a business plan, and then pretty quickly I quit my job, and we started Global Health Corps.
So how do you, just very quickly, we tend to think of this as something only young people face, but all of us go through different phases and cycles in life, as represented on this panel, where we pivot from something we've done that might be comfortable or even not comfortable to something bigger, something a little more fearless. When you look back at that time, because I think you were working for the Smithsonian at the time, so you had a good job. For those of you that don't know, and I think most do, Barbara's parents are President and Mrs. Bush. And so you went to your parents and said, I'm going to quit my comfortable job, and I'm going to go try this crazy thing. What would you do in you, and what would you sort of offer as advice? And we shouldn't think of it, as I said, just to young people, but to anyone who's poised looking at making a big life decision. What was it that helped you be fearless?
Well, I think we had this idea, and And it could be a great idea, but we wouldn't know if we didn't try it. And what would have really driven me crazy is if I just had this on my to-do list forever and never did anything about it. And so it just seemed like we might as well give it a shot. If it didn't work out, it didn't work out, but we tried it and we knew that it didn't work out. Or if it did, then we could continue iterating to make sure that it was as effective as possible. So I think that's what, it was just annoying to me to think, like, what if we don't act on this?
Right.
And so we did.
So I'm hearing, you know, we showed you the principles up here in the video, and I'm hearing a couple of things in your story. One, that you didn't really fear failure. You knew that failure could happen, but you wanted to give it a try. You tried new things, and you let urgency overcome the fears you had as you were looking at doing it. So, great story. Okay, Senator Warner, before you came in the room, we talked about your great success, which is honestly pretty unique in our day, at bringing two sides together in a very divided Washington and in a very divided political environment. You did that both as governor, and now we've seen you play that role as senator. What kind of fearless principles do we need at work on the political front? And you know, we've directed this, really, we say, to the social sector, but we realize these fearless messages can be applied across sectors. What would you offer on that front?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jean, for having me and for doing this and continuing to push the edge on how we make change possible. And picking up what Barbara's at, I mean, I was a little used to it because everything I'd ever tried, I'd failed at. You know, I failed. I still lay great claim to the fact that I was the only member of my Harvard Law School class of 1980 that didn't get a job offer from many of the places I clerked as a summer associate. You know, and after I went into, people said I had some success at business. Remember taking my first business, I took my life savings at that point, $5,000, and invested in a little startup company in 6 weeks, helped the company go broke. And second business took me 6 months to fail. First time I ran for politics, I got beat. So the idea of taking a chance and being willing to fail is, if there's one theme that I've had, at least in my life, and I think if you look at many people who, quote unquote, are successful, there's probably been a path of failures along the way. And you know, I think on the political side, as governor, when we were able to, I was governor with a 2-to-1 Republican legislature, and we managed to do a major tax deal, budget deal. And folks all remember that. They forget the fact that the first year I was governor, particularly the downstate press corps called me the most naive, inept, Pollyannish. Everything that I tried, I got rebuffed at. I got as much more grief from, I'm a Democrat, from the Democrats because I kept trying to reach out to the Republicans. You know, and I think that you've, in politics at least, you've got to be willing to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and acknowledge that neither side has all the answers. And particularly, in this day and age, my sense is that most Americans don't trust either political party enough to give them a blank check. And there's nothing intellectually better about a bipartisan. It kind of becomes code that it might be in the country's interest. So I just think that's, I think if you keep at it, and you've got to earn somebody's trust if you're going to get something done, at least in a political sense, in a bipartisan way. And that means it occasionally showing, at the front end, showing that you're willing to kind of go against your own team to gain the respect that you're not just mouthing it. A lot of people mouth these things but then don't follow through on it.
So essentially you're talking about taking risks.
Taking risk. You
Right.
got to take a risk. And it oftentimes means risk not only in terms of risk of failing, but risk of, at least in the political sense or business sense, offending your biggest supporters.
Sure. A huge problem in the sector that we deal in really is, it's a very relationship-driven kind of thing. Things start and they seem to never have an end. But the other thing I wanted to ask you, we saw your remarkable leadership, and we thank you for it, in the recent passage of the Bipartisan Jobs Act, which, Steve, as a citizen, played a very strong
Huge
role
role.
there. we had a number of different organizations around the country lending their voice of support to try to really give air cover to the bipartisan effort that was going on in Washington. But one of the principles we're talking about today is bold alliances. And so do you think, I want to say to this room here, because you guys are on the front lines, you know the issues cold when it comes to different society issues, et cetera. How important is the voice of the sectors here, and how can these kind of bold alliances, Steve is a citizen playing a role, organizations lending their voice, et cetera. Do we need more of that, and how will that help us be fearless?
I think we absolutely need more of that, because with Steve's effort and the overwhelming data that shows that, if we're thinking about how do you create jobs, that 80% of the jobs in the last 20 years have come from startup companies. Well, how do you help them? Well, you got to allow them to get capital, or you've got to allow them to get talent. So we got the capital part done. Now we're trying to work on the talent piece with Startup 2.0. And there are many, many of our elected officials, I think more than people would assume, that want to do the right thing, but there's not reinforcing mechanisms to do that. Most of the established groups in this town are about keeping the status quo. So one of the things that is, Gene, I'm kind of obsessed about the debt and deficit. As I have groups come in and talk to me as senator about whether it's a global health initiative, whether it's a disease state trying to fix, I find that lots of do-good groups don't want to get out of their comfort zone, so they don't want to. They're a little afraid of, they don't want to offend anyone. And if we're going to be able to overcome the status quo, you guys have got to get out of your comfort zones to be involved in this political process. I know this is kind of a long way around. I don't want to take much time, but we all remember back in the 90s when there was that debate going on, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, who's going to have more of a transformative power? Well, both can have huge transformative power. But for all government's flaws, it still can put more resources behind change, and you guys have to be kind of the tip of the spear in helping to make that change, and that means you've got to help provide that cover to elected officials who want to be bold, help get out of your lanes on issues. The debt and deficit issue, for example, will affect every one of you, because if you care about social change, if we continue to simply slash domestic discretionary spending, that means the government's ability to be any kind of collaborative partners with you when health or education or innovation are going to dramatically decline. So you got to be in this battle. You got to be in this fight.
Thanks for that. And I think, bold collaborations, as we talked about, is one of the principles. And I think, Tom, a question for you. Mark's point was a really good one about, who wants to work together and who doesn't. But I think as a sector, we face this too. My own experience coming out of the private sector was, although competition was often very fierce in the private sector, we understood when we needed to partner or collaborate. I was quite stunned as I moved over to the social sector here in philanthropy to find that that's just not how we do it here. It's very siloed, very no, we're not really in the they might take our dollars instead, et cetera. So what have you found around this in terms of who's effective and who's not? How important is collaboration, and what are some really great examples you've seen?
Well, do you have an easier question? Let's see. Well, first of all,
good or bad examples.
Yeah.
You don't have to name names.
Fair enough. The one thing that seems to be true in life, and certainly in the social sector, is we don't accomplish anything by ourselves. You just don't. Even the myth of the great entrepreneur, the entrepreneur has a team, and the entrepreneur has capital supporters, investors, and the entrepreneur has all kinds of advisors. None of us do anything important alone. So if you believe that, then you say, how do we collaborate on its multiple dimensions to achieve a shared aim, a shared mission? And one of the things that we discovered in moving from the business world to nonprofit world, and I should say that was a tough transition. You always think you know so much, and what was shocking was how much I didn't know. Moving from a Bain & Company, a corporate world where marketplaces sort of reign supreme in many ways, to the nonprofit sector where marketplaces are subdued at best. In the business side, people have incentives to collaborate because you make more money or can achieve greater market share or have a better supply chain at a lower cost position. A whole bunch of reasons. In the social sector, the incentives to collaborate are muted. Oftentimes there's more disincentives. So for example, all of a sudden my nonprofit organization loses share to some other or loses funding or something. So where we have seen it work is where it is designed into the strategy. Remember I said earlier, what is success and how are we going to achieve it? If you have the right people buying into the we, we're going to achieve it in the following way. There's going to be a public-private partnership. If you look in conservation, that happens all the time. The Great Bear Rainforest, the Nature Conservancy, I've been involved in the Conservancy for quite some years. That was a coalition of public and private entities. It was a coalition of multiple NGOs, all working together to one of the largest conservation programs, landscapes ever conserved in North America. It took many years. They had a shared definition of success. They worked at it together, a shared strategy, a shared approach. Where people come in late or where people are worrying about me, not we, it doesn't work, and that's often the case. Philanthropy has a unique role to play in this because philanthropy can, in fact, encourage, with money, collaboration that would not otherwise have occurred.
So Barbara, thinking about Global Health Corps, a couple of questions for you. When you think about measurement, how do you think about it? Because measurement is one of those things, as we talk about, in terms of effectiveness and impact, that sometimes is missing as we look out across the social sector. And also comment on the first principle was make big bets. And when I think about the big bet that you and Johnny came in and presented to us when it was just an idea, it was really about transforming healthcare. I mean, yes, it was about these fellows. Yes, it was about, these places, these things. But at the end of the day, it was a really big picture, big, bold idea. How much of a role do you think that played in getting folks behind you? And how important is that as, you go out and talk about your story and get people engaged in your work?
Mm-hmm. Both really good questions. Quickly, just so everyone knows what our model is. And this goes to collaboration. The way that Global Health Corps works is that we partner with existing nonprofit and government agencies focused on healthcare delivery, and then they identify areas of need. We recruit recent college graduates up to age 30 to work for them for a year, filling the specific gaps that they have. And our fellows always work in teams of two. It's always two fellows from two different countries working together, so it really is a global group of young people working on global health challenges. And then throughout the year, and this has changed a lot since we initially started, we do a ton of training and bringing our fellows together really around policy, advocacy, entrepreneurship, and intrapreneurship. So we don't really care. We want our fellows to be incredible at what they do. So one of them might be incredible at supply chain management, and we want him to be a great practitioner, but he also needs to know how to advocate in his country and how to change policy in his country. So I think on measurement, first of all, a big piece is making sure that our fellows are effective in their year with us as fellows, that they help the organizations where they work reach whatever targets they have, whether it be strengthening the drug supply chain, or we have fellows that are architects that built a brand new hospital in Rwanda that made really small changes in the way that the air flows throughout the hospital so that the outcomes of people getting TB have dropped drastically. So whatever the goals the organization has for the fellows, number one is that the fellows help them reach those goals. But I think we really realize that we can do so much with our alums, and we actually should make sure that our fellows feel this sense of urgency that we're talking about now throughout their lives. So it's not enough if they do this for a year and they wanted a great adventure and then they go somewhere else. We expect them to end up moving the needle on global health issues after this, which is why we do so much and sort of forcing them to learn about policy and advocacy and how, if you're in Rwanda, who is the person that you need to talk to really sort of change their mind? Who are the big decision makers that you need to get in touch with? And how can our fellows use whatever sphere of influence they end up with afterwards to affect further change? And we're 3 years old, so we don't have that many alumni, but we're already now trying to invest. We want to invest equally in our alums as we do in our current fellows, because we realize that is more of there's more power there.
Right. And do you plan as you go forward to sort of track what happens to the alumni as they go out into the world and how they continue to play a role?
So I think we'll definitely track that. And actually now we're building out alumni programs. It might seem super premature, but our fellows are so hungry for opportunities to continue to engage in broader dialogue. Awesome. They're all writing op-eds. They're all doing sort of things that that we hope that they would do, and they're actually doing them, and they want to be doing more of them. So I think we're really trying to figure out how can we build out the alumni programs now and not only track them, but sort of push them to continue acting with this urgency.
So Mark, you're known for so many things, but one thing our global audience may not know is that you're one of the co-founders of Venture Philanthropy Partners here in Washington, D.C. And we are in Washington, D.C. today, and for many of us, we saw that as a really big idea in our region here, and we've been investors in VPP since the beginning. Can you just talk a little bit about that model and sort of why that's fearless at a local level and how entities might look at that?
Well, I think it was born of having had a career as an entrepreneur, and I think Tom's point is right. It's always no entrepreneur alone that doesn't do it with a team. And looking at so many of the folks who have huge hearts in the nonprofit sector, but are so grossly inefficient, in delivering, or their passion doesn't translate into necessarily as effective action as it should be. And one of the, I don't know if we'll get to it on this session, but I often have believed that it would be good, just as with government programs, you need review it sometimes and shut some things down. There needs to be more willingness in the nonprofit sector for organizations to sometimes die. The flip side of now, that wasn't why we started VPP, to start to let nonprofits die, but it was based on the notion that we as folks who had been, many of us who were involved, and Jack and Gene, you and Steve and Raul and Mauro Marino and others, we'd all been involved in helping companies grow, and if we had some value add, we thought, how do you spot that great talent and I'll help them get to scale? And so my thought, I think our idea was, rather than just giving that one additional check that might be able to serve 50 additional kids, let's take a defined region, a defined set of problems, at-risk youth in the greater Washington area, and put together sufficient enough resources that you would have ongoing multi-year commitments, and that we would focus more on capacity building, identifying that management team and growing it. And we are, gosh, it's Jack, a decade in? Nearly 12 years. And, I think, echoing what Tom says, for a lot of us from the business side, we think all these skills are totally translatable over to the non. It's a lot harder sometimes on the nonprofit side.
Definitely.
And we've had our ups and downs with VPP, but I think there's a lot of successful role models, and there are an awful lot of kids in our community that have better lives because of the investments and the teams that we invested in.
So you talked a lot about failure, and I want to throw a couple of questions just out to the three of you and whoever feels they want to jump in. One of the things that we talk about is the importance of what we call rip the Band-Aid off, right? Do the hard thing. And what you were just talking about, we do know that many things start with the best of intention, but one of our famous phrases around here that we like to use is vision without execution is hallucination. And so there are a million, that's an Edison quote, there are a million.
There's a lot of that where I work.
Well, that's the idea. We all have a lot of good ideas, but we don't necessarily have the ability to take those ideas and turn them into action. How do we in the social sector rip the Band-Aid off? How do we say, wait a minute, this isn't working, and how do you as leaders do that in your own organization? And I'll say, as we've teased out this Be Fearless conversation in the things we've done in the last few months, it's amazing to me how it resonates with people, and often people will come up after and say, oh, that sounds so great, but how do I even begin a dialogue in my organization about really focusing on acting with urgency, or getting rid of the old ways, or embracing something big, or all of the different principles that we're putting forward. So what do you guys have to offer on that? How would you suggest people sort of take the first bold step of looking around and being willing to rip the Band-Aid off, if the Band-Aid needs to come off, or pivot, change, or just have a dialogue around how can we be fearless. I will tell you that for us at the Case Foundation, when we decided that we were going to embrace this be fearless idea, we go through decisions now and we say, are we being fearless? And it sounds crazy, but just the very idea of asking ourselves that question, you would not believe how many times we found ourselves led by caution or fear in a direction we might want to go, or unwilling to go in a direction because we fear that this or that might happen. So just having the dialogue has made such a difference. But what would you tell organizations about how to face some of those things? Any one of you? Sounds like
Any one of me, as long as I start. Okay. Thank you.
That's why you're on the panel, Tom.
I guess so. Well, two patterns, I guess. One is, in general, the observation I'd make in business, in the social sector, and philanthropy, and life, by the way, is the same. The people who achieve things tend to do fewer things in a more significant way for a longer period of time. Fewer, bigger, longer. So you've been at this, you guys have been at this for 15 years. The next 15 years ought to be better than the last 15.
Still
God
trying
willing.
to get it right. Absolutely.
Yeah. The point is, fewer, bigger, longer is a really important pattern because it takes persistence, it takes courage, and the ability to adapt. And that's within fewer, bigger, longer where this ripping the Band-Aid comes off. Because in that context, you might have a set of goals, but you have to constantly ask yourself, what's working? What's working? No kidding. Not what do I wish would work. Not what do I really want to make work because I'm doing it. What's working? And my co-founder, Jeff Braddock, has this phrase, inquiry and advocacy. We're often advocates. We say, this is working because I'm doing it, as opposed to asking the question, what's working? And so the pattern that I see for people who succeed is this tandem of fewer, bigger, longer. So this, I'm going to get to the top of this mountain no matter what it takes. But within that, I'm not going to commit to a path. Because if this one's a dead end, man, I'm backing up and moving up another ledge. So your ability to adapt along the way is astonishingly important. But absent a destination, you're not going to go anywhere. So I'd say it's toggling back and forth between those two, knowing where your aim is, and then being able to be courageous and blunt and a truth teller along the way to say, you know what, this is painful, it ain't working, plan B.
Well, I think it's good time, but in the kind of actual implementation, I think that you've hit an area that we still haven't figured out totally. I mean, as financial times on kind of large dollar philanthropy gets tighter, as government, in terms of supporting initiatives gets tighter, I fear the tendency is to continue to fund the status quo, to continue to fund because donor A or executive director of somebody's program is a great person, they've had the relationship, and consequently there is almost an unwillingness to get this great new initiative that these two 30-year-olds may have started. They don't even get to the examination standpoint because we're not looking at new projects this year, or we can only barely afford to maintain what we're doing. Too often, when we have, and I say this from, as a donor with my own foundation, and I can't really speak to it as much around VPP. I think we probably do a better job, but I sure as heck saw it as governor more than as senator. This, particularly in government notion, well, rather than going ahead and saying, let's just eliminate a couple initiatives here, we cut back everybody on the same amount. And we don't make those hard choices. So I think as a policymaker and as a donor, I need that how to rip the Band-Aid off process. I think we need to do more of it.
So you also talked about broadening the spectrum. The last question will go to Barbara, and then we're going to open it up to questions both in the room and with our online audience. But Barbara, you talked about urgency and really making sure that not only do you have a sense of urgency in your own organization, but as your alumni go out, they also embrace that. I think of your generation as caring about urgency, the fierce urgency of now. One of the things that we often tell organizations that we're working with who ask us about, what makes our work sing, we often say the infusion of millennials in our work, both their different perspective and, you know, some of the ways that they look at things. They're, you know, the same old siloed ways, just they don't look at things the way we were taught to look at things. So can you talk a little bit about both the importance of your generation playing a role as organizations, whether they be traditional organizations or new organizations? You know, what's the importance of having the millennial voice? How do you see your generation influencing the stuff we're talking about? Because I'm very hopeful, and you've heard me say I think your generation may be the next greatest generation and really hold a key to a lot of these, you know, barriers we have to overcome. But do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Definitely, and the reason that I love commenting on this is because every day I work with people that are in my generation that make me hopeful that we will solve these huge global health challenges that we're focused on, but whether it be global health or education or, you know, whatever issues our age group is focused on, I feel like our fellows, I'll speak to them, are just bringing such a different mindset to global health. I mean, you've sort of been mentioning the status quo and sort of this business as usual attitude, and our fellows are so the opposite of that. And one of our best mentors is the health of Rwanda. Her name is Dr. Agnes, and she always says, she says this to everyone, so I'm now acting like it's my phrase, but she loves our fellows because their business is unusual. And that's her whole way of looking at how the health ministry of Rwanda should be working, so that they don't need to be receiving aid money for the same things that they may have already dealt with. And so, you know, how do you change this status quo and be bold to stand up and say, we actually don't want to take aid money because this isn't an issue anymore, rather than continuing the same dichotomy that's always existed. But anyway, I feel like that's the attitude that our fellows are bringing to this work, is sort of being open-minded and thinking about other ways to approach the same problems that we've been approaching. And, you know, we've heard collaboration our whole life. It's been like such a buzzword, and,
Right.
you know, in school, it's like we were taught to be collaborative. But that being said, I think our generation is unbelievably collaborative and sees why different skill sets should be working on huge problems, and that things don't have to be, you know, done as they always have been. And that's why I feel like we can make a lot of progress on these huge issues that we've been always dealing with.
Yeah, we agree. So I think I'm going to turn to questions at this point, and I'm looking to my group over here. I think we have a microphone for you. You can just hold for one moment so everybody can hear your question.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for having this. I think this is fantastic. My name is Maria Teresa Kumar, and I'm the president of Voto Latino. And, oh, excuse me.
We want to get you on camera, so
stand up.
please stand up so we can see you.
You might see bumping. Don't be distracted. And my question actually is, we basically started as a nonprofit startup about 8 years ago with the radical notion that the majority of Latino voters actually spoke English and used technology. And that was a radical idea that we had to send back to Silicon Valley, and they're the ones that got very engaged. But what I found was going through the traditional means, and Senator Warner, you mentioned it, and so did you, Tom, was that the biggest challenge was really trying to get funders to be fearless. And funders to be fearless so that they could actually create modernization even within existing nonprofits. What advice can you give individuals that have those big, bold ideas? I mean, we've been around for 8 years, but we're still 8 years young compared to folks that have been doing it for 25 years. So any feedback would be appreciated.
Well, I think, and the challenge is always, how do we get the right metrics? I think too often nonprofits, governmental aid organizations, measure inputs as opposed to outputs. We're still not all that good on getting the output piece done. And I think you're dead on that traditional donors, have some affection towards, old institutional organization. I think it raises this issue again that Barbara said here is, do you change the organization from within, or do you start the new startup competitor? In terms of, I'm struggling with the question because I wish I had a better answer. I don't know how. Again, that's one of the things we think that we tried to do with VPP was providing a new platform with a lot of donors from this region who were willing to have VPP almost become the screen, and then VPP could continue. And then you had, particularly in the case of this region, a whole lot of folks who were relatively new money, who didn't have an allegiance to a particular world organization, and many of the VPP members have then gone off on their individual capacity and then supported organizations. How you replicate that on a broader scale, I don't know, but I think it's a really, really good question. I wish I had a better answer.
I would just add, out of today, we're hoping to identify some fearless organizations who come forward. And even if they haven't been fearless in the past, we'll say we're willing to be a little more fearless. And we're hoping that some alliances form that will provide a little bit of air cover around risk, right? Because if we go together, it's less risky for both of us because we're in this together. So through the Fearless Pledge that we're putting up and the dialogues that, you know, we hope many of you lead and that we'll play a role in leading as well, you'll start to see who are the fearless funders and who not so much. Do we have another question? Steve.
Good afternoon. Thanks for doing this, Jean and Steve. Steve Culbertson, I'm the CEO of Youth Service America, and I work with the fearless generation. They're biologically fearless. We know from brain science that kids are willing to take risks. They absolutely seek new things, and of course they seek that pure authority. Our biggest block are adults, frankly, who are getting in the way of kids changing the world. You know, and so my question is, what advice your adults, you're sitting up there, you're the problem. That, you know, when kids look at
Should
that,
we leave now?
you know, as a generation,
I'm still really immature.
they're loving you. But
I can attest to
But
that.
you know, it's that idea that adults don't want to share power with kids. They don't want to let them, you know, into their world. And so with their very fearless approach to changing the world, they come up against this kind of glass ceiling. I love this. Today's the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, when women got the vote, by the way, if we didn't notice that in today's group. But, you know, for kids, it really is almost a civil rights issue on how they can be institutionally fearless to change the worlds and the problems that are affecting them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's actually why I asked Barbara the question that I asked her. You know, I have tried in any board I've been on to advocate, you know, for the voice of the millennial, even at the board level in many cases. And I think nonprofits often, when you look at the boards, you know, are all a similar generation that are not necessarily indicative of today's generation. And so I think this diversity of voices and views really can help us all be a little more fearless. Tom?
Yeah, I'd just like to broaden the scope a little bit in that I'm optimistic. I'm actually highly optimistic about the next 20 years. And the reason I'm highly optimistic is not the capital that's out there, but the leadership talent that's out there. And it's not just the millennials, it's people in mid-career. You know, I was sort of early 40s when I transitioned, but that's not unusual anymore. And it's encore career folks. You know, so you see talent migrating today. You wouldn't have seen a Bill Gates, a Pierre Omidyar, a Jeff Skoll doing those things 30 or 40 years ago. They would have kept working right up through 65, then probably played golf. Those guys wouldn't have played golf, but they would have done something like that. And then kind of cruised to the finish line. That's not happening. And so you see the flows of leadership talent, whether it's a few hours or whether it's full time, dramatically shifting. And if you took a snapshot of this country 20 years ago and where the leadership talent was coming from and how it was deployed versus today, it's totally different. Teach for America, you know, 50,000 applicants for 5,000 positions. We have 200 plus for every entry-level position. I mean, look at how many applicants did you have for the 90 slots?
5,000.
amazing.
5,000. You know, these are younger people, but we're getting, if we open up a partner-level slot for somebody in there, say 40-ish, we'll get 300, 400 applicants. And so there is something going on here that is a fundamental shift. And everybody, if you talk to a venture capitalist, if you talk to a social entrepreneur, anybody who invests, everyone in this room will say, what's the single most important ingredient in defining success? It's the leadership. It's the talent. That is always it. City wouldn't be City if it didn't have the right founders, right, Michael? You can't say that, but I can.
We can say it.
We can say it. So I look at the talent flows, and I think it is millennials, but it's not just millennials. And what excites me is the kind of cross-generation collaborations that have the potential to really move the needle on problem solving in a way we never, ever have.
Okay, I think I'm told we have an online question we're going to. Is that correct? Jenna?
We have several online questions. So our first one is for Barbara. Someone online says, urgency is important. Can you also speak to having solutions in the context of urgency? Urgency alone can cause hopelessness.
Agreed. Well, I think a few things. I mean, I think acting with urgency when you're also acting thoughtfully and sort of with a plan on what you're meant to be acting on is pretty crucial. I think the reason I bring up urgency so much is I have sort of a fear that our fellows or whoever that's working on these issues does tremendous work on them for a few years and then becomes complacent and sort of starts thinking, okay, well, these are huge problems and I actually can't do anything about them by myself. And then you lose the urgency, and then it doesn't really matter if you have the talent because they're not acting on what they should be. And so I think a lot of the programming that we do is making sure that our fellows see themselves as one of 90 people working on these huge issues. So if they have a bad day, they know that 89 other people are working on these with them and can support them. And I think that really helps continue this sort of desire to move quickly and act on problem solving.
Okay. Jenna, did you want to take another question from online? And then I think Michael Brown has a question as well. Did you put your hand up, Michael?
Sure, we'll do another question. So this is a question for anyone on the panel. How do you deal with adversity, and how do you build healthy boundaries to differentiate between what can control and what can be controlled and what can't?
If you want to,
You know, I'm grapple with that every day. I
Yeah.
I don't. You know, I think that is a. Again, I'd like to give you I'd like to give the questioner a neat answer. I think a little bit about Barbara's point that if you feel like you're pounding your head that day, realizing that there are others in the same fight, in the same struggle, I think having a plan. And I think it is, I would agree with your comment, the millennials and this enormous urgency of youth, but then trying to also put a realistic timeline around that, so there's not that frustration that, okay, we didn't change it in 30 days, in 6 months, in a year. Some of these problems have been with us enormous amounts of times. So how do you set, I keep coming back to metrics, how do you set metrics along the way that you can see at least small successes that kind of reinvigorates that sense of urgency? So having that timeline, recognizing there's a community of people out there helping you or fighting the same struggle, and setting markers along the way that may not cure world hunger, but that you can see identifiable, tangible progress along that path, I think are really important.
I heard that as perseverance with passion, right? And Barbara, what you were talking about is you don't want that passion to fade. But when you face adversity, staying the course is what Mark was talking about, not giving up.
And also, again, I think the point that was probably made earlier, and I tried to make it in mine, is that recognize you're going to fail. I've never been involved in a nonprofit. I've never been involved in a startup business that ever met its business plan. What makes a good one from a bad one, whether it's a nonprofit or a business, is how do they respond to the fact that they didn't meet their business plan, or they didn't meet their goal in as straight a line. This is not a straight line business, especially in the social venture area.
And what's so funny is, obviously going back to the importance of other voices at the table, if you surround yourself too much with the sector, maybe people don't know that. If you don't have the right voices at the table, maybe you haven't lived in a world where it's just understood that you start with a plan, but boy, you shake and bake, and sometimes the way you end up looks nothing like where you started out, but you might have gotten to your mission, just through it.
But don't you think, Gene, that particularly when I'm thinking about younger people, you and I see this kind of in my business, you hear the introduction of somebody who's up here talking or standing on a panel, and every introduction that everyone ever gets is their successes.
It's true.
And so, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, this person has done X, Y, and Z, and how can I ever do X, Y, and Z? But I would imagine that 95% of the people who are getting these glowing introductions, chances are they've had an awful lot of failures along the way. Trying to you're a politician, you try to keep telling your staff, put the failures in as well. I got plenty of scars from all the failures, but the failures have been the most important learning lessons I've had.
Remember that. Michael Brown, founder of City Year, has a question. Behind you there, Michael.
Thank you. This is a terrific conversation.
Oh.
And I was really struck by the 5 statements, the 5 principles that you put forward to start this. I think clearly you put tremendous thought into them, because as each one came up, you saw us all nodding. That's incredible. That's powerful. That's important. The one that really struck me off the top, of course, was the first one, place big bets. And I was recently rereading President Kennedy's speech when he called for putting a man on the moon in 1962. We're almost at the 50th anniversary of that. And in doing it, it was really interesting. He said, by setting this goal, we will have to create metal alloys that do not exist and build heat shields that can withstand half the heat of the sun, neither of which existed. So just the idea of setting these goals. And my question is, in this time, a lot of social entrepreneurs were focused sort of on the ground. We're very sort of micro. There's a lot of happening politically that seems to be preventing getting big things done. How, as a society, from your different vantage points, can we focus the society again on setting big bets?
I'm going to turn it to my panel. By the way, on the week where we just sent a private sector rocket out into space successfully, right? But go ahead. Good. Thoughts?
Well, I'll dive in. I actually think people are inspired by big bets, but sometimes they are not fully formed. In other words, if you looked at what's going on in American higher education even today, universities are raising all kinds of money to do amazing things, whether it's stem cell research, whatever. I mean, they're raising their capital campaigns, making big bets in some venue. We don't have, as a social sector, consistent capacity to identify and frame a big bet that then others can participate in. We're not necessarily all that skilled at developing them. But partly, as you pointed out, Michael, nonprofit organizations are mired down in this year's budget and all the tactics and things like that. Philanthropists can also get focused on spending out their 5% if they have a foundation or what have you, and lose sight of big problem-solving opportunities. And yet people want that. That's the anomaly. People don't want to do, most of us don't want to do little things. Who wants to do really little things with their lives? Okay? Little tactical things that no one will ever know occurred. Who wants that? Of course not. You want to do big important things. But sometimes the big important things aren't well articulated, aren't well framed, aren't compelling. So we haven't yet figured out exactly how to do that. Maybe that's a leadership issue, maybe it's something else, I don't know.
So we've had a terrific experience, in a number of initiatives that we would say are big bets, but the reason we would say that is because we had partners that, people want to buy into the big ideas. And Mark, I want to give you credit as honorary chair of Billion Plus Change. That was a really big idea, and in a nutshell, what that did was called on corporate America to take that talent we were talking about, which nothing gets done without great talent, take their talent that they have that the nonprofits often don't have and contribute it to the nonprofit. And Mark leads that effort. And did we not set out with the goal of $1 billion? And before we could announce it, we passed $1 billion in commitments by corporate America. Now imagine if we'd put that goal at 100 million. We probably would have been announcing 100 million, but we said, no, we're going to go for $1 billion. And then we got on the phone before the launch and we're like, we got to raise it. Now it's $2 million. But the point is, our experience has been, you call people to a high place and you've got people standing in line to play a role. It has to be, Tom, you're so right, a real plan, going back to that execution thing.
Well, I just want to, I think Michael, you raised a really good point. I don't want to default to my day job, but here's the kind of good and the bad I think we are in this country at this point. The challenge is that a lot of Americans, I think, have lost some faith in some of our institutions and folks in my business and in our governing institutions. That's the downside. The upside is that, I think the Australian foreign minister said this the other day, America is one small budget deal away from kind of not only reclaiming a spark to an economic engine that will have enormous power, but also reinvigorating that kind of can-do spirit. And the notion that the political parties, that the people you've hired, me and the folks that I work with, can't kind of check our Republican and Democrat hats for a little while and do a relatively small, we're not being asked to do what the folks in Europe or around the rest of the world are doing, a $4 to $5 trillion deficit deal over 10 years. It's not putting a man on the moon. It's not, curing cancer or defeating communism. So in a certain sense, it's good and bad. The bad is it doesn't seem to be that audacious, shouldn't be this hard, but if we do it, the most powerful effects it'll have on the economy and I think on the American psyche and on just our sense that we are again a country that can meet any challenge makes this both an exciting and terribly frustrating time to be working where I work. But you ought to demand it out of us, or if not, fire us all.
Barbara, do you want to add anything? I think we're going to...
I feel like everyone said it. I mean, I think, you asked from our vantage points, and I think the group of people that I now hang out with are all sort of people in the nonprofit world that are my age that are choosing to do this work and are putting their whole careers on the line to do what they think is something audacious. And so, so maybe it's just the company you keep, but I see people doing this every day.
That's great. Well, I want to thank our panel, Tom, Barbara, and Mark. Thanks so much for being with us today. We're really grateful. And for all you do. And so now I think we're going to take a little break online, like a minute and a half, while we transition to the next segment. Thanks.
Thanks.
Tweeting on behalf of our...
That's right. He's been tweeting on behalf of all of us.
All right, everyone, welcome back. Welcome back to our online audience and to our in-person audience. Before I introduce our next moderator, I want to go ahead and make a couple quick public service announcements. One, I want to thank our partners at the Aspen Institute for co-presenting this live stream with us, and I'm glad that we have so many people in the Aspen community joining us online today. I also want to remind people that are following along at home to check out casefoundation.org/BeFearless, where you can see the paper and you also can see the principles. So now allow me to introduce the moderator of our next session. The moderator of our next session is a lot of things. He's the former chairman of former chairman and CEO of CNN, former editor of Time, chairman of Teach for America, appointed by President Obama to chair the Broadcasting Board of Governors, board member of United Airlines, Tulane University, overseers of Harvard University. He is a loyal native and champion of the city of New Orleans, as they say down there, having recently served as vice chair of the Louisiana Recovery Authority after Hurricane Katrina. He is the author of several acclaimed and best-selling biographies, including most recently Steve Jobs, Einstein, and Ben Franklin. But most importantly for today's conversation, he is a longtime friend and colleague of Gene and Steve Case and a faithful partner to the Case Foundation on efforts ranging from social innovation in the United States to expanding educational and economic opportunity around the world. And I can personally tell you he is as dedicated to changing the world as he is to documenting its history and great change makers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the CEO of the Aspen Institute, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. And it was a very nice introduction that only understated one thing, which is I've not only been colleagues of yours, I think I've worked for Steve ever since I had Isaacson at AOL.com, which is still my personal secret email address.
Not anymore. Isaacson at AOL.
We're going to see that tweeted as we
And I
speak.
am the chairman, or at least one of the many co-chairs of the Gene Case fan club. So it's great to be here. I know I heard you all talking about it, but maybe if you could give the background to the Be Fearless campaign, how it started, what it's supposed to be.
Sure. So we've been talking about this for about the last hour, and what we're really talking about is putting forth a set of principles today that came about as an opportunity we took at our 15th anniversary to look around and look back at what's brought meaningful breakthrough kind of change in our society. So it's a message to the social sector, to those finding and funding new breakthrough opportunities to put society forward. And that's what we're talking about today.
And Steve, how have you applied some of these maxims, both in business and in the nonprofit sector?
Well, certainly, and Walter was kind. He actually was one of our first and earliest partners at AOL, at least 20 years ago when he was in charge of all the digital strategy for Time Inc. before he became editor of Time, before he became head of CNN, before he became Aspen. You know, he was an early believer, and even when we only had a few 100,000 customers at AOL, one of our earliest media partnerships was with Time. But certainly what drove us in the 80s, and I think drove you to get involved with us in the 90s, was a belief there that we're going to change the world by creating this new internet capability. And literally we're trying to get America online. And at the time it was fearless because most people, when we started, only 3% of households were online, and they were online about an hour a week. And most people thought it would never be more than a narrow kind of hobbyist kind of a market. Even when we went public, AOL was the first internet company to go public 20 years ago. At the time, we had less than 200,000 customers, and most people on the roadshow said, like, what are you talking about? Why do you think we've been at it for 7 years, only 200,000 people? It doesn't seem like there's broad appeal. But we believed and were fearless in pursuing the vision, setting a big goal, assembling a team that was passionate about the idea, and just sticking with it. But it really took us, as you know, more than a decade before we really even got traction. It was a decade of believing in that idea and just staying at it, having the perseverance, even though a lot of the evidence then was it wasn't going to amount. So not surprisingly, we took that same approach and tried to apply it to some of the work of the Case Foundation the last 15 years, and just realized that taking these risks, being fearless, it really is what motivates us to step up and take risks we otherwise wouldn't take and be out of our comfort zone, because otherwise you're not going to have great successes.
It included setting audacious goals. That's what you did in the early 90s, but how are you doing that now?
We were talking earlier, I think in collaboration with partners, we try to look at big bets on a variety of fronts. You and I have worked together on one called the U.S.-Palestinian Partnership, now called Partnership for a New Beginning. And you know what we saw in that big bet was the opportunity to bring a bunch of sectors together to try to create educational and economic opportunity in the West Bank of all places. And you know, we had great success bringing partners into that. Why did we? Because there was a big bet there that if you could condition the environment for peace, maybe it would actually lead to peace. If you think about the history of that region, a lot of violence, a lot of hopelessness, and we were remarkably successful in getting companies to come along and play a role, individuals to come along and play a role, foundations, et cetera, to basically put some things in place there that without that big idea, they just wouldn't have been players.
One of the nonprofits I've been involved with, as Michael said, is Teach for America.
You chair that board, do you not?
And being chair of that board, he may have watched the Queen's Jubilee yesterday. It means like being Prince Philip. You get to walk 3 steps behind the Queen and carry her purse. Yeah, so that's what I do as chair of that board. But I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that your webcast.
Yes, exactly.
They're loving it. Are you kidding? That's what they came for.
Don't tweet this to Wendy. Don't tweet this to Wendy.
Wendy will love it too.
But, you know, Wendy set a mission statement, which was somewhat audacious, which is one day every kid in America will get a shot at a decent education. And about a year and a half ago, she said almost what you've been saying, which is we've got to be fearless. We've been making incremental change.
Correct.
That doesn't work. We now have to decide how we're going to make transformational change.
Right.
How does that lead to a different way of thinking?
So I think it's different on a bunch of fronts. It's the willingness to take risks and try new things, to let urgency guide you so you can put your fears behind you, and maybe be willing to be first, right? I think in the breakthrough things we've seen, it's somebody stepping up, usually with partners, but sometimes on their own, saying, I'll be first, I'll take the arrows right here, but I'm going to go try. And then, hopefully when you go try, if you don't have success, you'll let people know what were the lessons learned, so the next one that comes along a little faster, a little further, until you've broken through. And Steve and I actually were on a hike this weekend, and we were talking about how failure is part of this conversation, and accepting when you try new things that failure might be an option.
We hiked to the top of this mountain here to take the picture.
Yeah, right. That failure is one of those things no one is comfortable with. But as we started going through, some of the things that at the time and you were on the ride with at AOL with us, there were times we thought, we might be staring at failure. But 9 times out of 10, you can look back and go, okay, maybe that didn't work out the way we planned, but this, and this happened later because that happened, and we couldn't see it at the time. So part of this is just a willingness to take risks, to accept that failure may be an outcome, and if it does, we say fail forward, make it count, make it matter, so that either the person that comes behind you or your own efforts to go forward are better.
Some of it also is we all have learned that momentum begets momentum, and the question is it positive momentum or is it negative momentum? Success begets success, winning begets winning. The ability to take these risks and start seeing some accomplishment, some momentum, not only rallies you, but rallies others around you. We certainly saw that in the early days of AOL as the internet became more significant. People started rallying and being part of it. But it takes somebody taking that first risk. Nobody thought you could break the 4-minute mile, and then Roger Bannister did and said, well, I guess it's possible. I guess I could, I may have to train, maybe I'm not quite fast, but clearly it's possible. Somebody did it. First person to climb Mount Everest went from being impossible to clearly it's possible. So somebody has to go out there and take that risk and demonstrate it is possible. That then motivates others to take a greater risk in whatever they're doing. And when we talk about risk and fearless, obviously, we said in the earlier panel, it is also about execution. It's not just kind of making some bold statement and then just assuming automatically, wave your hands, it's going to happen. It's going to take a lot of work. As I mentioned, AOL was more than a decade before we even begun to get traction at it. But just taking a stand and saying, even those earliest days, we're going to change the world. We're going to build a medium as important as a telephone or the television. We're going to completely change and improve the way people get information, communicate. Most people looked at us, including, frankly, my parents, like, you're crazy.
Right.
This is
they
like,
didn't know
this
we
is,
did for a
this
living.
is silly.
Yeah.
But we just stuck with it. And I think we've seen many examples of that, including folks in this room who've been doing this for, in some cases, decades, and just putting themselves out there, setting a goal, trying to rally people around that goal, and taking big risks. We just need to let that be a model for all of us and get everybody to kind of step up their game.
So Walter, I warned you that although you were going to interview us, we were going to interview you a little bit. And you're a great storyteller. You're a great storyteller, and you've chronicled, some of the greatest innovators of our time. I kind of want to turn that question to you a little bit. Like, one of the things we appreciate is that you chronicle some of the failures of the people that are icons today because of the breakthrough things. What do you think about in the stories you've written and the people you've chronicled in terms of great iconic failure stories and their importance?
Every single person I've written about hasn't necessarily been smarter than the people around them. I mean, we all know a lot of smart people, and they're kind of a dime a dozen. They don't always amount to much. It's the people who think out of the box, take the risks, are fearless when it comes to innovating, and know how to, as you put it in your statement, build on failure, learn from failure, or whatever. And there's a certain persistence that comes with that. I mean, you can take the person who everybody considers the smartest of the lot, which is Einstein. This is a guy who gets turned down on his dissertation when he's trying to get through the second best college in Zurich, the Zurich Polytech, because they don't think he's right. And yet he's still trying to figure out why is it that according to Maxwell's equations, no matter how you move in a light beam always travels the same way relative to you. Now, that seems like it's sort of a simple thing, but it's puzzling all of physics. And there he is, unable to get a job, and he's failed so many times at figuring this out. He's finally synchronizing clocks, looking at devices to synchronize clocks, because that's what the Swiss patent office, you know, the Swiss are kind of Swiss. They want their clocks to be synchronized, and so when it strikes 7 in Bern, it's got to strike 7 the exact same time at Zurich. And in order to do that, you have to send a signal that travels at the speed of light, whether it's a light signal, radio, or electric signal between. And he said, well, I get it. If you're moving really fast towards one of the clocks, what looks simultaneous to you will look different to somebody who's moving fast in the other direction. So the speed of light's always constant, but time is relative depending on your state of motion. Now, that's not totally intuitive, but it's also just a leap of the imagination.
Right.
And it came from over and over again. He said, you know, when he was 17, he started walking around with his palms sweating, wondering about Maxwell's equations. Now, I don't know about you, but I know me and Steve, when we were 17, what was causing our palms to sweat weren't Maxwell's equations. But, and you see it, I mean, you see it with, you know, Woz and Steve Jobs. Over and over again, they're risking the entire company because they're on the verge of bankruptcy, but he wants to hold it up and put the graphical user interface on the original Mac. Or he wants the exact perfect glass on the face of the iPhone. And so people who sort of stretch do things that are unexpected. And I think it goes back to what Steve was saying. They all had a personal mission statement in a way. Steve Jobs knew that he wanted to make the most insanely great computer that everybody in America would want a computer in their home. This was something nobody had thought of. It was like in the early days of AOL. What, a computer in your home? No, computers are big old things that are in the closet in the office. And so it was an audacious idea that drove him. And now I'll turn it back to what Steve was saying, because I've always been impressed by your ability to make mission statements reach statements, or whatever it is. They almost reach. And start from the earliest one at AOL, which you just mentioned, which was a simple mission statement, but it was really a concept of reach, right?
Yeah, and in fairness, we always had a, when we started, it was a few dozen people in a little office in Tyson's Corner, so it wasn't, there were, most people didn't think the market existed. To the extent people thought the market existed, the leaders at the time, like CompuServe, were viewed as Genie and division of GE and so forth, were viewed as the leaders. So our initial years was just kind of like get on the field and just stay alive and try to create some interesting products. But as we got some traction, we always believed it would be a big medium, but it took us a few years before we had enough traction to set that even bigger, audacious goal. And it's not just to motivate other people, it's also to force us to step up. It's almost like setting a goal that is such a reach, it's almost scary. But you said, I'm going to take that risk. I know the probability of success is not high, but I'm going to shoot for it. So like, kind of using the baseball analogy, really kind of swinging for the fences. Of course, you can get on base if you've got a bunt, but you can't win games if you don't have a strategy to win. You can't just win by defense. You need offense. You need to be bold and ambitious. So I think setting those goals for all our organizations are critically important, and following it up with a team and a execution strategy so you can credibly deliver on it, but erring on the side of setting the bar high, because that forces you to step up and forces everybody in the organization and people working around you to step up as well.
It also means making the goals clear, simple, and easily understood, which you all have always done. The person I still refer to as the other Steve, meaning Steve Jobs, his greatest success came from the failure. I mean, he said that at his Stanford commencement speech, which was the notion of having been kicked out of the company he founded and having those years in the wilderness caused him to aim even higher and to have an even clearer vision when they have to recall him to Apple in 1997 to take over the company again. And when they do, he said they had lost the simple vision, which was to make insanely great products that everybody would want. And instead they were trying to make profits. Right. And when you chase profits instead of great products, eventually your profits tail off. And they had tried to milk the profits by, they had 40 different types of Macintoshes by, 1997. And Steve, when he gets called back, goes to a whiteboard and just draws a little grid, 4 squares. He says home, office, desk, laptop. and he puts in, the iMac, the MacBook, and says, that's it. We're just going to make 4 computers, get rid of everything else, and make each of the 4 great. And that's how he saved the company.
And it was partly also, because I remember when he went back into Apple, he called me and wanted us to do a new version for AOL. Everybody in the industry had given Apple up for dead. People forget this now. Because I think they had 3 or 4% market share in operating systems. Right. They're a completely irrelevant niche company. So even going back into the company and saying, I think we can build from this base. Now it's the most valuable company in the world with all these products everybody kind of loves. But when even the risk of going back in, the probability of success actually was low. But he said, I'm going to figure out a way to do this and put the strategy in place and the team and the deep focus on great products in very specific kind of ways to make sure they're insanely great products.
It's funny because we've hit on a couple of things in this conversation that we hit on the previous panel as well. And that sort of 4 square described, Walter. Tom Tierney was talking about doing fewer things. And I think because we're talking about the social sector, we're often really guilty of getting mission creep, right? And sometimes that's because there are just so many great ideas and so many ways we want to change the world. And sometimes that's because funders will say, well, I'll fund you if you'll do this, right? And I think one of the things we're trying to do is make sure fearless conversation, we're thinking about the special challenges of the social sector. And Mark Warner, in opening his remarks in the last panel, started by talking to us about his failures. And I was thinking, where everybody says, how do we get started? Like, how do we transform our organization or ourselves? Can you imagine if we started more meetings with, let's go around the table and talk about what we failed at this week? I mean, it would just really, maybe it would make us more comfortable with the understanding that, that does happen and may learn from each other's failures. Or your point, how did we stretch each other this week? Or even individually, when we look at our plan this week, how are we stretching ourselves this week? It's like amazing to me that asking the question, having it on the radar screen, what that does in terms of making you sort of attend to things.
I can't say that Jean is very good at identifying my failures each week.
Never allow other people to identify them for you. When I asked Steve Jobs what his greatest failure in terms of his company was, he said something rather interesting, which gets to y'all are almost the opposite of it. He said, we often tried too hard to go it alone, and I wanted to control the whole widget. I wanted to control the hardware, the software, the content, whatever it may be. Whereas Bill Gates, even though I don't think he made great products, was more open to collaborations. So Microsoft had the gene of collaborating, Google now has the gene of collaborating, AOL had the. And one of the things the Case Foundation has always emphasized, it seems to me, is that genetic predisposition to collaborate and leverage. Is that right?
I think that's really right. And we are willing, and I say this to everybody here, and we've worked with most of you, so you know this, we're really willing to try stuff first. I think we just had to get comfortable with the idea that we would take risks. And so if somebody wants to try something or do something, come talk to us, because if it makes sense and somebody needs to take that first step, we'll be willing to do that. And that was not an easy decision for us to make. We talked earlier about just how we had to grow into our shoes that way. At first, we were reluctant too, but now we see that as okay. But someone has to have that role, so we'll play that role. We'll play with partners.
But it is. We also learned some of the first things we did. Both at AOL, like launching a site called helping.org or our Power Up initiative, Digital Divide, is that once they become associated with your company or your foundation, you personally, then people are less willing to be part of it. They want to be founders too. So actually with helping.org, we wanted to bring in other partners. So we brought in Yahoo and others as partners and renamed it Network for Good, because that was, but they didn't really want it to be helping.org, because that was sort of the AOL thing. They wanted it to be Network for Good. Similarly with Power Up, we built 1,000 technology centers to bridge the digital divide, but we had a lot of partners there. But early on, we should have figured out a way to make them all be founders as opposed to supporters of the cases kind of idea. So it's a balancing act, being able to experiment, taking some risks. But once you get some traction, how do you bring people in? Some of the things we've done more recently, like the Startup America Partnership, was with that idea. On day one, we had a lot of founding partners.
Right.
We didn't want it to be identified as somehow our thing, and then later on say, oh, you can tag on if you'd like. It was collectively our joint thing from day one.
Well, one of my other heroes, Benjamin Franklin, one of the maxims in Poor Richard's, the first Poor Richard's Almanac, was it's amazing how much you can accomplish if you aren't dedicated to taking all the credit for
Right.
it. And one of his tips or tricks, I was going to say, was always to find the best ideas in the room and then make everybody else in the room believe it was their idea as well in order to get that collaboration. There are a few principles. I was reading, some of the documents and work that you've done on it, a few themes that you've touched on, and I want to throw them out. One of them is democratizing philanthropy. What do you mean by that?
So I think we're really passionate about this, and we've worked with many people in the room and probably some people online in this as well. We just really felt like philanthropy shouldn't be just a bunch of rich people writing checks, that we're just leaving way too much at the door if we do that, that there's a tremendous opportunity to hold hands together and come together in sort of almost a crowdfunding kind of way, asking people at whatever level they can jump in and play a role, and if it's giving their time or giving their money, micro donations. I mean, we have Network for Good. Bill is here from Network for Good that Steve just talked about. That platform, together with two others, has represented over $1 billion in giving by individuals, most of that being micro donations. So huge opportunity for leverage and getting everyone to play some role in philanthropy. There's just not enough money in the world of the richest people in the world to really have the impact we can have. It's going to take everyone doing a little bit.
And this is where the internet, obviously, and particularly social media is helpful. This idea is not a new idea. The people ringing bells for a Salvation Army at Christmas would do it, or direct mail campaigns saying, please give to my cause would do it. But the ability to do it at scale and to reach lots of people relatively efficiently and to talk about your idea and advocate for your idea and attention to your idea, and then for those who are interested, either make a donation or commit time as a volunteer, it's unparalleled what's now possible, and trying to make sure we're doing that with our initiatives, but we're also partnering with lots of different organizations. One of the things at the case.org site is a lot of tools that we've learned that we hope others will adopt so they can pursue their cause with more scale and more efficiency.
The Warren Buffett, Bill Gates giving pledge, it always seemed slightly problematic to me that it was an exclusive club, that at least for people like myself who would love to be part of such a giving pledge, it was almost like, you're not quite in our league, therefore we will not talk. How could you conquer that?
Well, we joined that a year or so ago. We had some concerns, frankly, going in. That was one. Was it a little bit elitist and was a little showy? Like you're sort of like, we're going to give away money. But we concluded that it was an appropriate thing to do, principally for two reasons. One was we actually came to the conclusion that shining a spotlight on this issue would lead some others at various levels to also give, and even the letter we put on the Giving Pledge site talked about it, what Gene described, that we want to use this as a way to shine a spotlight on the needs out there and get more people engaged at whatever level. Indeed, I think the greatest gifts, which we said in the letter, are the people who have nothing but still manage to find a few dollars or a few hours to give. So that was one. But the second was we also believed, and we're starting to see the benefits of this, that these folks are making significant commitments. They're going to be giving away a lot of money. Rather than have them each do it themselves in their own silo and often make the same mistakes over and over again, some discussion, some collaboration, some learning, particularly learning from the failures, could help inform everybody's activities and result in likely more leverage and scalability for collectively everybody's work. So that was really the key, the combination of saying let's use this as a springboard to democratize philanthropy, so it's not quite as elitist, but also for these givers, how do we share more stories, if you will, so everybody is a little bit smarter, a little bit wiser, and therefore has more impact, which is really what it's all about. It's not about, obviously, the input. It's really about the output measured by impact.
Tell me what you've learned from the president's, being on the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, that might apply to some of this.
Well, Senator Warner was talking about some of the frustrations of being in politics these days, and I think I saw the frustration on both sides. The country's frustrated with Washington and the Congress, White House, and so forth, but the people on both sides, House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats are frustrated too. So that was one thing. But the other really is about collaboration, and as you said, trying to get people focused on a particular idea and work together in a collaborative, in this case, bipartisan way. So there was a whole process over the past year around policy that's supportive of entrepreneurship. The first of that was the Jobs Act, which was signed by the President a couple of months ago. The second is the Startup Act, which was introduced by Senator Warner and 3 other senators in the Senate a couple weeks ago. I think there'll be an announcement in the House this week. Getting people to focus on the role of entrepreneurs and creating jobs, driving innovation, but doing it in a bipartisan way, doing it in a collaborative way. And in terms of the Be Fearless principle, when we started focusing on this, everybody said, why are you bothering? Nothing is going to happen.
Right.
Nothing happens in Washington. It's partisan gridlock, and now you're in an election year, and for sure nothing is going to happen. You're just completely spinning your wheels. Nice of you, well-intentioned, but there's no chance of this happening. Kind of why bother? And almost like you're setting yourself up for failure and embarrassment. But collectively, folks working on it said, no, it's an important issue to the nation. Jobs, economy, innovation, competitiveness is important. We got to take a shot. It is the right thing to do. There's got to be some way to knit together a coalition, find some common ground, bipartisan support, and it took some ups and downs and twists and turns, but ultimately it was able to happen.
But you created the Startup America Partnership coming out of that, right, in order to help push both the Startup America Act.
Yeah, there was different parts to it. Some of it was launching the Startup America Partnership to get the private sector mobilized to help entrepreneurs get companies started or scale companies.
With the Kauffman Foundation.
With a partnership with the Kauffman Foundation, then a variety of companies that became supportive of that. Now we've launched, in fact, today, the Startup team is in Boulder, Colorado, with a summit of all the Startup America regions comparing their best practice, exactly what I was talking about with Giving Pledge. How do you learn from what's happening at each of these local levels? So part of it was celebrating entrepreneurship, part of it was corporate commitments, over $1 billion to help entrepreneurs, and a lot of it was building up these startup regions. But just if that was all we did, that would not have had enough impact on the problem. We knew it also required some legislative action that in terms of a global battle on talent around high-skilled immigration, things like that. So it really was a multifaceted, set an audacious goal, even though there's considerable risk of failure, but it's a battle worth fighting, and let's figure out a way to knit together bipartisan support.
It's part of my role in life to always be a follower of you, follow you on Twitter, and it made me feel part of that movement because I was getting a tweet, especially when the votes were about to happen, every few hours updating it. How do you think...
Maybe every few minutes, to be honest, Walter.
Well, I only... How does social media change the playing field for philanthropy and for nonprofits? Hugely empowering, and we've already seen this. We are tracking foundations and nonprofits that are really doing some remarkable things in social media. We spend a lot of our time working with nonprofits, actually companies, governments. This week we'll do our second Summit on Innovation with the White House, in which 35 federal agencies will come together to talk about how you use prizes and challenges in social media to connect citizens with better opportunities to engage with their government and be served by their government. So we think there are just unbelievable opportunities for social media to reach out, engage more people, bring more donors, bring more spotlights to causes, et cetera, than we have traditionally, and level the playing field at the same time. Our early experiments in social media where we let citizens champion causes they cared about, the causes people thought were the greatest causes were, in most cases, causes they'd never heard of at all. It was not the Red Cross, it was not Habitat for Humanity and the ones we all know who have big marketing budgets. It was these sort of citizen-enabled causes that got a spotlight because of social media. In some ways, social and network media has infused the entire philosophy of what you do. It's not just that it's a tool that you use.
That's right.
But they seem to be based on the same foundation.
That's right. So not surprisingly, we spend a fair amount of our time at the Case Foundation focused on it and looking at ways, working with partners, that it can be leveraged for good.
You often speak about service as a solution. It came up a little bit earlier in this conversation. Explain what you mean by that.
Sure. So I'm looking at Barbara Van Dalen, who started something called Give an Hour, and she's a fearless leader, and we were just with her and her organization last week. And essentially, she's in the mental health field, and she saw as the wars went forward and the deployments multiplied for these families that there might be a gap in terms of mental health services for military and their families and vets. And so she started an organization calling on mental health workers and doctors to give just 1 hour a week pro bono to military families and vets and families of the fallen. And Barbara, you have 6,000 or 7,000 doctors in your network now, all giving at least an hour a week. So it's a beautiful example of people using their core skills to make a tremendous difference and of scale. It was a really big idea that Barbara had. So, you know, if she had called one-on-one, oh, come on, you're my friend, will you just give this family? Wouldn't have gone anywhere. But the idea that she created this big vision, then brought in alliances to make that happen, today it's really filling a really, really critical and important gap in our communities. And so we tip our hat. We think that's a great example of service as a solution.
And it's also an example of, you know, one person can change the world. She was sitting in her office dealing with clients and said, I think there's this problem. Just her in her office. And she said, I'm going to try to see if I can get some other people and get some other people and get some other people. And then 2 months ago, she was listed as Time Magazine has their 100 most influential people in the world.
And Barbara's one of them.
So she went from less than a decade ago, just minding her business, doing her business, you know, this little idea, and then figure out, no, I'm gonna pursue this. And you know, I know people are going to tell me it can't work, but I think it can, and I'm not sure how big it can get, but I'm going to give it a shot, and kept building on it. I think it's an example. It's not just, you know, we have the benefit of resources and visibility and other kinds of things, and we understand that we've got some advantages, but other people who don't really have those advantages still can take an idea, and if they are really passionate about it and build a team around it and really, you know, kind of set the bar high and execute well against it, you know, they can change the world. This is the history of America, the history of the world, people being willing to be fearless and kind of set the bar high and take those risks.
And I'll say, we'll go now to questions and answers, but the original social network in America was, of course, created by Benjamin Franklin, which was the U.S. postal system, which was specifically created in order to organize people in the colonies, in order to work together both in terms of the politics, but also what you would now call nonprofits, whether it was the American Philosophical Society or the Militia Corps or the Street Sweeping Corps, everything he did. Let me go to the audience for questions.
While you do that, can I point out, we have Harris Wofford with us here, Senator Harris Wofford, who was one of the founders of the Peace Corps with Sergeant Shriver and served in Ethiopia in the first sort of Peace Corps deployment. So talking about service as a solution, you know, in an audience like this, how do we begin to describe people who could be up here and talking to us? So thanks for being
the video
with us.
We had earlier, it quoted Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and like he's worked with both of them.
Yes,
so
right.
it's like a little intimidating, kind of humbling for us
Kennedys
all.
and Kings is a great
whatever.
book to read.
Exactly.
It's still available, sure.
I should say that I am.
Let's get you a microphone, Harris.
I am one of the. Is this on?
Yeah.
I'm one of the failures of the Case Foundation.
Oh, come on.
Yes, indeed, because they got me to be an advisor, senior, whatever the proper title was, because of your plot and Steve's, that this would make me faster by far than was going to happen by finishing the book of adventures over, then it was 7 decades, and now it's 8 decades. So in the end, it may be that my failure to do
finish the book.
One day Steve said, why don't you just go away for 3 weeks and write down all your stories? Right, any case. So Gandhi was a tremendous failure from his point of view, because by the end of his life, he had said, vivisect me, but not India. And he wanted independence to come peacefully, and it came with probably the most terrible riots of the century and millions killed, and partition came. He considered himself a failure. I think one of your great achievements today is to make all of us see that failure marries, failures matters, and marry it, and see what you can learn from it.
Great.
Thank
Thank you, Harris.
Thank you very much, Harris.
I'm going to do my best.
Thank you. I want to use a prerogative to call on Jane Wales, who runs the philanthropy and public sector programs at the Aspen Institute, maybe to ask the first question, because she really has helped do the best practices roundtable for people in the world of philanthropy.
That's right.
Thank you. So we started today with your talking about collaborations and partnerships, and one of the areas that you've been participants and you've been champions of cross-sectoral partnerships. I wanted to get your sense of the attributes that each brings to the table. You think of governments as bringing accountability, private sector is bringing efficiency and scale, the social sector is being agile and responsive. When you think about the philanthropic sector in that, what are the key attributes that need to be preserved?
In the philanthropic sector?
Yeah, I mean, we think of philanthropy as having a capacity to take risks that others don't. How do you preserve that capability?
I think we think of them as having the capacity to take risks, but not being particularly risk-taking. I mean, because in the same way that nonprofits sometimes are afraid, to use donor dollars to take big risks and possibly fail, our experience both as philanthropists and in working with philanthropists is sometimes we fear that too. But I think philanthropy can play a huge role in helping to call people to this higher place together with a group of partners or in collaboration. I think they can be cheerleaders, they can be investors in work, they can be a tremendous source of early capital. In the business realm, it's often, it was that early capital that made something happen, and philanthropy can be that as well in our society.
And also some intellectual firepower. I think part of what animated the whole debate in Washington around entrepreneurship and ultimately led to the Jobs Act was the work of the Kauffman Foundation, which is focused on entrepreneurship, has been doing work on this for decades, and some of their data that demonstrated the central role that entrepreneurs played in driving job creation and innovation really got people, the policymakers, paying attention. And without that as a starting point, we wouldn't have been able to build the support, whether it be on the government side or on the private sector side. So being a catalyst for change and kind of trying some things out and then figuring out ways to plug those ideas, whether it be into the government, which clearly has the ability to scale things. It is leading investor in education, healthcare, and so many other things. So if you can take some of these ideas, prove them out, and then put them into this broader system, it can have more impact. Figuring out ways to plug them into the business side, and we think there's some interesting things bubbling around the whole impact investing space, where you're trying to build bridges between these two worlds and have kind of more do well, do good kinds of companies. But ultimately, it is the philanthropic sector who's got to be out there kind of championing these different ideas and doing little tests around the fringes, around the edges, that then people can learn from and try to then take to scale.
Questions, please. Yes. Sorry.
So that's Barbara Van Dillen that we talked about earlier from Given Hour.
Thank you, and this is a wonderful conversation. Thank you for having us all here and for your nice comments about our work. And one of the things that I struggle with, the work we're doing is about collaboration and trying to knit together organizations. And one thing that seems to be so very critical is follow up and follow through, and asking in these communities, organizations that are highly strapped in terms of the resources that they have, and they want to they want to go the extra mile, they want to do more, but they have few resources, both in terms of either financial resources, manpower, but it's a matter of leadership at the top, but it seems very difficult to help the organizations at the grassroots level with the heavy lifting required. And I would love you to speak about the follow-up, follow-through, and how we, who are maybe the leaders, can demonstrate that, can model that, and encourage that, because I think so much more than can be done in the collaborative kind of model that we're talking about.
So, we talked about focus earlier, and I think making sure that organizations look at their true capacity, not what they wish they had, but their real capacity to get things done, and have a conversation about that that's very, real with yourself, and goes back to that limiting the mission somewhat, I think is really important. And then, when Mark was here earlier, he talked about VPP and philanthropy using capacity building granting. I mean, that's another way for the philanthropists that are with us or the donors that are with us is to grant to enable that. So for instance, when you're thinking about what you need, you might want to think about helping your organizations connect with organizations that can fund capacity for them to help you, you know, on the front lines, basically. I don't know, other thoughts?
Yeah, the only other two things I'd say that you know, some might disagree with, I guess, but one is also really sharpening your focus and trying to figure out how you put more resources around the core idea of something most organizations are not very good at. Going back to Steve Jobs, that was actually one of his core skill sets. He always said the key is figuring out what not to do, not what to do.
Right.
Both not. Yes, I think there's something in television. Yes, I think there's some. Right now, I'm just going to focus on the iPod music. Okay, that's done. Now I'm going to focus on the phone. Now I'm going to focus on the first like 3, 4, 5 years each. I would not, and with each of those initiatives, focus on the details within each of those to get them, great. So I think a focus is a big deal. The other thing in our experience, because it'll start with dozens of people, and its peak at 10,000 people. Most of the best work happens with small teams that don't have much resource. That's where the innovative breakthrough thinking is going to go. Which is not to say when you're scaling organization, you need feet on the ground, or depending on what your particular initiatives, you need certain ways to if you're providing food, you need the food. There's a lot of things that are specific to it. But the real breakthrough, innovative, be fearless thinking can happen even with small teams. Indeed, maybe only can happen with small teams. And so instead of being concerned about that or frustrated about that, celebrate that, embrace that. That actually is a strength as well as a limitation.
Michael.
So I'm just going to step in for a second. We have, it looks like about 20 more minutes of discussion. As Tom was talking about earlier, we often think in philanthropy that all of our children are above average, like the children of Lake Wobegon. Well, we have them all here. And we want to make sure that you not only get a chance to continue asking questions to Steve and Jean and Walter, but we want you to also tell us where you think we should go next as well. Both all of you here in person and also those of you online. So continue to ask questions if you like, but I want to pose a couple questions to you as well. The first question is, how does your organization stay fearless? Who inspired you to be fearless? And then we really want to hear from you, how can we really take this dialogue forward to make sure that this is turning into something where we can have more fearless approaches to creating change? So I hope that can be the rest of the conversation as we move forward. And Walter, there'll be some questions coming from you online as well.
Great. And so who's fearless? In the way back, we have fearless. Please
Fearless
tell us
would
who
really
you are,
be if we're supporting your initiative, but you think we should focus on other things, telling us not to support your initiative. Now that would be fearless. If anybody wants to put up their hand.
So I'm Diana Wells from Ashoka. Thank you for being such wonderful partners as we've been fearless over the years.
Yeah, you have.
We stay fearless with our remarkable network of social entrepreneurs around the world who are a daily inspiration and get us through those bad days along with our team. And one of the things we have done internally at Ashoka is to have an annual Fail Fest where our staff presents their failures. And the first year it was a little quiet, but having some of the most senior folks, the celebrated leaders within the organization, talk about their failures, what worked, it's tipping the best practice idea on its head. And by starting with the failure framework, you get what you would do better next time. So I offer that as a really fun way to celebrate and demonstrate and build the culture internally within your organization and community to be honest and to have fun along the way.
That's a really cool idea.
That is, and I want to say you're here. That's a really good thing to
if
share.
I can add something, they did that at Ford when Alan Mulcahy, I think I'm saying his name right, came in as CEO. And the first time, it wasn't a fest, but it was a meeting where people had to talk about where have I failed, or some failure. And it was obviously hard to get people to say it, but what was particularly important, Alan said, was that the first person who stepped up eventually and said, here's a major failure and blah, 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 he made sure that that person was given more responsibility so that it would empower people to step up to their failures and their fears, as opposed to, because everybody's looking around trying to figure out, is this guy nailed toast? Yeah.
Well, and the key thing there, obviously, it sounds like what you're doing, is people are always quick to point out other people's failures.
Mm-hmm.
That's easy. Like it's kind of finger pointing. It's really more pointing out your own failures is what you learn from and other people learn from.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have an online question, Jenna?
Yes,
The
we
voice
have
of
some
Jenna.
online questions. So the question is, how do you make sure you're hearing innovative ideas from people outside of your usual circle?
I'm not sure what my usual circle is, but a lot of it is just, I think, getting out and about. I mean, if you're just kind of in your office and having meetings with the normal suspects and attending conferences in the normal areas, you aren't exposed to a little different ideas. But again, one of the great things about the internet broadly and social media in particular is you can, if you force yourself to, learn a lot of things and get exposed to a lot of different people. And certainly the phenomenon around Facebook, more recently Twitter, a lot of that is the appeal. You bump into ideas and people in different ways that are kind of the classic thing. I remember when I was kind of going through college and starting in business, it was sort of this notion about management by wandering around. You should get out of your office and wander around a little bit. These digital technologies enable you to wander around the world and learn all kinds of different things but you have to make an effort to do that. You have to prioritize it, and you have to be going to places and talking to people that you might not normally be going to or talking to, because that's where you're going to learn things that kind of change the way you think.
And you saw we have as a principle, reach beyond your bubble. And that idea really is when you're at a table, look around. Who or what is missing? And if it's missing, how do you go find it and make it part of the dialogue or conversations that you're having? And we talked on the earlier panel about what that can look like. That can look like age, that can look like background, that can look like sector. But basically, if you're not mixing it up, you're not reaching beyond your bubble.
And to add something in this celebration of social media and digital media, I'll add something that Steve Jobs used to say, which was it does really help, too, to have physical meetings. And that's why when he designed the Pixar building or the new Apple headquarters, he was worried that people were just emailing or on listservs or doing chats electronically, and that sometimes actually reaching beyond your bubble and getting new ideas and innovation comes from when you bump into each other and then you say, what are you working on? And so I do think the management by walking has not been replaced simply by the management by having, an open G-chat rooms or something.
I thought that it had been replaced by the Aspen Institute.
Right. Well, I was making a subtle plug for physical meetings in places.
I think that's
that's what we do. Do you have another one, Jenna? You're holding the mic as if.
We've had a few people ask about this, of how can kind of the everyday person contribute to address social challenges and be fearless, and how can they connect with mentors who can support them? So Barbara had made a great point about folks that may not have enough resources, so we've had some people online asking about that too.
Okay, so we refer them to a variety of things, but the bottom line would be start somewhere, do something. One of our principles is let urgency become your fears, right? So in the water and start somewhere. And you can start small, you can start big. If you start small, there's tons of resources online. We talked about Network for Good, who's with us. Networkforgood.org has a lot of good stuff. You can jump in and play a role in, both in terms of time or money. Idealist.org actually has internship and volunteering opportunities and different ways you can get connected there. A number of organizations here would really welcome people to jump in and be a part of what they're doing.
And even some of the things that were launched today on the casefoundation.org site under the Be Fearless section included things like a Pinterest board where people can post, and some of the things already posted are unbelievable in terms of different ideas around being fearless. And you also mentioned with Twitter the Be Fearless hashtag. So I think there are a lot of different ways to spread kind of good practices and learn from each other. We want this to be obviously a collaborative. A lot of what we were doing today was announcing an idea, an initiative with some the beginnings of something that we hope everybody else will kind of take with and run with it and build into their own organizations or figure out ways to contribute more broadly to the idea.
Johnny Dorsey, could you talk a little bit more? I know you probably mentioned it earlier, but the question of young people coming out of college, trying to figure out the opportunities for service when they think about what would be their next careers.
Sure. Sure. Barbara said quite a bit already, and I now, and Barbara deserves most of the credit. She's overly generous. But that last question is what inspired us and inspires, I know, a lot of people in the room. Barbara and I are excited that there are so many applications for every position at Global Health Corps, but it also sort of infuriates us. It's what makes us want to grow more quickly. And so I know for Tom, those numbers of applicants to Bridgespan are incredible. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's this thirst to want to do more. And that's, you know, if one of the prompts was, what can we all here calling others to do and being fearless, I hope we figure out more ways to capture that energy. That's Walter's my boss's boss this summer at Aspen, thinking about exactly this. How can we help more young people launch these impact careers so we can make more rapid speed in tackling these huge problems?
Hey, Johnny, thanks for bringing that up, because if we were at Harvard or Stanford or any of the nation's great universities, you'd hear them say they're actually concerned that everybody wants to go to Teach for America and everybody wants to go do these great things. So you're right. There is absolutely almost a pent-up demand to go and participate, and probably what we need more of, the question was around mentoring, are just structures in place that do make it easy for people to plug in.
I think that's so critically important, which is the structures in place to allow people to plug in. Because one of the things that happened after the hurricane in New Orleans, there was an outpouring of interest around the country. People saying, I've gotten 500 knapsacks donated.
Right.
We've put things in. What should we do? And it was very hard to channel the pent-up energy. If you go to Harvard or Stanford or whatever last week, the week before, right before graduation, and you go to the Charles Hotel, you see Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, whatever, with their rooms and their application process and everything else. Teach for America's success came because we replicated that notion of here's how you can channel it and go to an underserved school district, not just knock on the door in inner city Cleveland and say, can I teach here? But we channeled it. There are not those channels easily enough for people to say, well, I could go to this room and fill out an application and apply for a job in management consulting or finance, but there's no sort of set of rooms you can go to be channeled into service as easily, other than a few of them.
So, Tom, I'm thinking this could be a big idea we could talk to Bridgestar about as an, as a group here, as maybe at the next gathering we have on this, thinking about how do we create more of those structures so people can jump in.
But the other piece about this, which with TFA or Global Health Corps I think is instructive, is it's a reach ask for people to be fearless, kind of go from the school to some, inner city Cleveland, what have you, kind of school. But it's also a finite period of time. It's like a tour of duty. And it doesn't mean they're set on that career path and can't turn back. If you said, basically, if you want to sign up for Teach for America, you must stay here for 50 years, most people wouldn't do that. But they say, I'm willing to do that for a certain period of time. It's going to be challenging, out of my comfort zone, probably a little scary. I'll learn some things, though, and then whatever I end up deciding to do, that path is still open to me. I'm not kind of pigeonholed as just this kind of person. I still have I have more optionality in terms of my career as opposed to less. And things I learned there, I'm confident I'm going to be able to apply in other ways. So I think that's a model that I think is helpful, because it able to step up for some period of time. I think makes it easier for them to make the sacrifice. That's why people who are, with the White House, for example, when they're asked to leave what they're doing to do that, it's for a discrete period of time, 4 years, maybe 8 years. It's not for forever, so they can throw themselves into that, knowing there's sort of an light at the end of the tunnel, and they come out at the end of the tunnel and can do other things. So giving people flexibility and optionality where they have that experience, but it's not going to lock them into that path forever, I think is one of the real brilliant kind of aspects of that.
But for the rest of their lives, they will remain, whether they're at an investment bank or a law firm, dedicated to the proposition that every kid deserves a decent education.
So you then have Peace scores done, and other things.
Further questions, thoughts? Yes.
Hello, Jackie Norris.
Hey,
I want to thank you.
Hello. Jackie is helping Points of Light to lead this connection of companies and talent to nonprofits.
We are. Thank you. I want to thank you in addition to being a professional, I'm a working mom of 3, and we've been talking a lot about be fearless and what that means. So thank you for the character education, for the dinner conversation. I have a question about. It seems to me like failure is getting to be cool again. You know, there is this narrative about we want to hide our failures. We don't want to talk about them. We don't want to tackle them. But when you look at the biographies and you look at the writings, we're taking it on a little bit more. And I'm just wondering what advice you have about how we continue to push and challenge media to celebrate failure and talk about it in a way that makes us more comfortable with it.
Great
so
question for you,
I'll put you on
Well,
the
I'll
spot.
tell you the bad side of it. Take, and I don't mean to sound partisan about it, but you know, Solyndra, which is if you're going to do venture capital and you're going to try to incent new industries, you are going to have failures. When everybody goes absolutely nuts and keeps focusing on, oh, this company went bankrupt, you will now have a risk-averse energy department that will never make such loans again.
Exactly, yeah.
And you know, I think the good thing about media today is that we are all media, and therefore, with social media, without the great gatekeepers or something, you know, we tried when I was at Time Magazine, we started something that Barbara's another beneficiary of, which is the Time 100, which tends to celebrate people, including people who probably had some stumbles or whatever. But I think it's hard to say, let us go march on, you know, Brian Williams and ask him, please, will you celebrate failure on the nightly news?
But some of it also, these kind of things, because of the nature of this gathering, we tend to focus on this, nonprofits and what they're not doing well and what they could be doing better, and should take more risk, be fearless, and so forth. But it's worth pointing out that the government side of things and the business side of things, they have their own problems too. The government's very short-term oriented. People are particularly focused, particularly in Congress, around a 2-year election cycle. As soon as they get elected, they're running again, and that absolutely drives their thinking and absolutely leads to short-termism and not being fearless. As some of the frustration you heard from Senator Warner. Similarly, on the company side, particularly public companies, are focused on their quarterly results and recognize they should take a longer-term view of things and take more risks. Most of the teams want to do that, but they feel the pressure from investors, which have shifted from individual investors, more like a Warren Buffett who holds for decades, to kind of funds and hedge funds that might hold for minutes or days, but really don't care about your next year. They barely care about next quarter. They're more focused on the next hour. So this short-termism thing has really hurt both sides. So there really is, although our focus here around Be Fearless is around what we're doing around the foundation, some of these principles really need to be embraced by others as well. But we as a society then need to reward, to your point, the people willing to take those risks. The people are, like Senator Warner, willing to come together, even if some people, and even his own party, are criticizing him for him. How do we make sure that's celebrated and supported as opposed to the evidence? Right now, the evidence for most of the people who have come together in a bipartisan way is they lose their reelection because of redistricting, gerrymandering, the districts are safe Republican districts or safe Democratic districts, and so if you come to the center, you're likely going to be knocked out in the primary by somebody who's more extreme Republican or extreme Democrat. That is why the politics have gotten more partisan. That is our fault as a nation and as citizens. So if we're going to encourage people to be fearless, we then have to back it up by supporting people who are willing to go out there and take the risk.
Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Young. I'm with the National Constitution Center in Philly. Thank you guys for this. It's been a wonderful conversation. I tend to make loud and expensive mistakes. My failures are big ones, and I wanted to share this in that it's amusing, sure, but I found myself at an organization that couldn't tolerate the expensive ones. So one of the things that I've learned after swimming upstream for a while is that we actually had to bifurcate our business model and at our core, we're a museum. We don't do anything quickly or nimbly. So we actually had to create an arm that accepted this as a philosophy and accepted, that was able to let our core business model be what it is, but create a vehicle by which we'd be fearless and take some risks. And it took a long time for us to learn that was okay and a way to do that. But one of the things I wanted to ask of you, and I think Michael's question is a very relevant one, and that is what we can ask more of from the philanthropic sector. And I would really love to know more about the failures that everyone else is making. You can find a lot of reports all over the internet about grant programs or gifts that were successful and what we got from them. But I think we've probably learned a lot too from what, and how we've failed and the mistakes that people have made. But I don't see that anywhere. And I would really love to see more openness from the sector about mistakes or things that maybe didn't quite get there, because that's probably where the kernels of good ideas are.
So let me marry Jackie's question about media and suggest there is an opportunity there. you know, many of you know I did a blog which was very, very hard to do on a failure we had in our clean water initiatives. But as I sit here today, I have never received more positive response for anything I've ever written than going out there and saying, didn't work so well. And it was very clear that people took comfort in just hearing that things don't work. And if somebody, and it was like the first guy that you talked about, that's how I felt a little bit. And it was really uncomfortable to do that, let me tell you. You make a great point, Allison. I think that there is, you know, we should look at ways, all of us as organizations, if we want to be fearless, to put a window on failure and to share those stories, both as donors and as nonprofits. And I want to comment on your other thought, because I thought that was really cool, where you talked about a different business model. Because, you know, back in our AOL days, when we were growing bigger and when we might have become just a little less innovative or a little more fear-driven, not totally, but in parts, we started something that was called the greenhouse. And the idea there was we put investments in sort of these new up-and-comers who were young, and it was almost like a little bit of arm's length, so we didn't have to take responsibility for what happened in that crazy space out there. But meanwhile, we learned from it, and if they got really successful, you know, we invested in them, and many of them wanted to be terrific organizations. And your idea is a great one, and I would say it's great both for philanthropy and for nonprofit and potentially government, which is, you know, create a side-by. If you're not in your core skin, if you're not really fearless, see if you can find a side-by-side channel where you can be a little more fearless and try stuff.
Some companies have done that with, you know, venture capital firms or kind of a labs project. Even the government's done it, particularly with ARPA, which is created the internet, was really organized as sort of a side effort. Even to this day, has more flexibility than other places. But it also might tie in with the media idea. Maybe there's a way to put together some kind of partnership. Everybody likes these, you know, lists of top 20 or top 100 or something. What are the top 20 or top 10 failures each year? But what, not just identifying the failures, but what was the lesson learned, and what did they then take that lesson and build from that? Because most of these great success stories, there's a pivot, and something didn't go right. They understood that, made some course correction, and that led to greatness. So it's almost the failure, the pivot, and the rise to greatness is probably the key takeaway. So trying to figure out almost a contest that's celebrated, and people then kind of look at those and learn from those, I think might be helpful.
Well, I think we have one concrete good idea coming out of this. I know that Josh Tierney on the back page of his redesigned Business Week often does My Greatest Mistake. Tina Brown now does that sometimes on the back page of Newsweek, My Greatest Mistake. But maybe there'll be a glorious failures part of the Case Foundation website.
In partnership with the Aspen.
In partnership with the Aspen.
Celebrate at the Aspen Ideas
where we can actually each talk about the glorious failures we've made and some of the things we've tried to launch. I'd like to thank Gene and Steve and bring Michael back on stage. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for the wonderful questions, and thank you, Walter, for moderating a great discussion, and Gene and Steve for being so honest and sparking a great discussion. And we look forward to you folks online continuing at Pound Be Fearless, and all of us continuing in person and checking out Pound Be Fearless as well. And I'm now going to turn it over to Gene and Steve just to close this out.
Okay, well, we thought it might be good to say, okay, where do we go from here? If this resonated with you or your organization and you want to continue the dialogue, what does that look like? And we have a few things planned. We have what we call some affinity conversations that we hope to have. Some of you in the room in your organization have already committed to help bring some convenings together so we can continue this dialogue. We'll have multimedia conversations and stories at casefoundation.org. You'll find some up there today, as we've talked about. We have a Be Fearless pledge. And the one thing I want to ask of you today is, if this makes sense to you or your organization, jump in and take the Be Fearless pledge. We're hoping that we see many, many thousands of Be Fearless pledges across the nation, and that's online as well. An announcement that we're making today that we're really excited about is, some of you may have participated in TEDx Mid-Atlantic, which happens here in Washington, D.C. This year, TEDx Mid-Atlantic will be sponsored by the Case Foundation, and its theme will be Fearless. So we're hoping to have more spotlights on fearless efforts across the world at TEDx Mid-Atlantic. And then we'll host a program called Finding Fearless on social media, in which we'll invite you and our entire, communities that follow us in social media and follow you in social media to spotlight their fearless stories. Who are the great fearless leaders they've seen, and tell us more. And then lastly, please think about what we've presented today. And in the same way that we want to talk about failure, we hope you'll tell us not just what sounds good what didn't resonate so well? Are we off somehow? Is there something we missed? What should we be doing that we're not, or what should we not think about carrying forward as part of this campaign? When we said it's a dialogue, we really meant it's a dialogue, and it'll only be a dialogue if we hear back from you after today. So Steve, do you want to add anything?
I'll just end where we began, which is really was three purposes of this. One was to launch this Be Fearless initiative, and I just heard from Jean, it's just the beginnings of something. It's sort of a skeleton, if you will, and we need your help to kind of put some bones. The second was to thank the many partners we've had over the last 15 years, because those collaborations, we've learned a lot. Hopefully we're smarter now than we were 15 years ago, and hopefully we'll be smarter still, you know, God forbid, 15 years from now, if we have the opportunity to continue to do this work. And the third was to take a moment to, even though we like to focus on the future and not too much on dwelling on the past, to celebrate this 15-year milestone. So we do have a reception upstairs. We're sorry the people online are going to miss out, but we'll be thinking about you.
Virtual cupcakes.
And thank you again for joining us.
And to
for a
our
great
team
discussion.
and to Walter as well. Walter, thank you very much for coming and being part of this special event. Yeah.